So what I'm going to do is something basically completely different. I'm not really going to talk about my research other than the one paper that sort of derailed my career, which is that Rookie's Guide paper. So just a show of hand-wavy hands, how many of you have read that, that Rookie's Guide paper that I wrote? Only 2 people. Okay, well, that's all right. Most of my advice is stuff what not to do. So you probably shouldn't be reading my advice papers anyway. So that's okay. I figure that, at least in the profession, I'm sort of known for 3 things. I thought I was known for that Rookie's Guide paper, but apparently not. But if you go to my SSRN page, this is sort of how to rookie, how to get a job, how to interview, all the good things that you want to know, or maybe you've already learned them. Also for being an identification nut, I sort of came around to the enthusiasm for identification and dealing with endogeneity carefully, relatively early for a finance person. And in the before times, taking off from conferences and sneaking out and going fly fishing when it's practical. So kind of ironically, what makes me qualified to be here, that Rookie's Guide paper also kind of derailed my career. So what I'm going to do is spend most of my time talking about my professional failures so that hopefully you can avoid some of the things that I did wrong. And then at the end, hopefully I'll have some time to just give you some brief sort of high-level thoughts on identification and sort of where the profession is right now in terms of how we think about these things. No fishing stories today, just stories about sort of my career path. So once upon a time, I was an assistant professor. So where you're going to be in, I guess, 9, 10 months. I was muddling along, I was writing papers. I didn't really have a lot of direction. I was just writing on whatever topic I found interesting and convenient and easy. And so one thing I did was sort of finished up the dissertation topic. That was a good plan. That was a good thing to do. And then I had another paper that was underway. It was an opportunistic paper using a natural experiment on short selling. It's one of the early natural experiment papers in asset pricing. And just so you know, if you are writing a paper that's related to short selling, this paper is a heartbreaking work of staggering genius. It's woefully undercited. So please validate me by citing this paper if you're writing in short selling or anything for that matter. I'll take it. And then that Rookie's Guide paper that apparently only 3 of you have read. I thought for sure that maybe people who were rookies would have gone out looking for advice, but I guess that's why I'm here today. All right. So what you'll find, I think, when you become an assistant professor is that life is not that different from what you're experiencing now, except that you're going to have a lot more money, and so you'll be able to drink better beer, and you'll still be working hard. Really hard if you have any sense. And that's what I did too. I was working really hard. I mean, just as hard, if not harder than I was in grad school, because I was excited to have this new career path and be working. And then I was fired. My wife insists that I refer to this as being not renewed at mid-tenure review or whatever. But the euphemism is not important and the distinction is not important in my mind. What was important in my mind is that then I was forcibly in the labor market. So just as a sort of informal poll, in the chat, why don't you type in the percentage number, what percentage of assistant professors do not get tenure at their first placement? Just type a number into the chat. What percentage do not get tenure at their first placement? Yada is very specific, 82. All right. It's not as bad as some of you think, but it's pretty bad. So 70% is the number. This is a statistic that originally I completely made up. But it turns out I was exactly right, because after making up the statistic and telling people everywhere that this was the number, there's a paper that Netter, Polson, and Kiesler wrote a couple of years ago that documents that it is like 69.8%. So I was like really spot on in terms of the percentage of assistant professors who do not get tenure at their first job. And so why don't they? why don't these people get tenure at their first job? Why is life that hard as an assistant professor? And the answer is, well, yeah. But we can think about sort of the whys and the why nots. It's not necessarily a lack of effort. What I often see of rookie assistant professors who are struggling is that it's not that they're not working hard. They are, they're working like crazy, but sometimes they just don't know what to do, how to direct their effort. And so sometimes, and certainly this was part of my problem back in the day, it was a lack of clear direction. How do you balance quantity versus quality of research? How do you decide what research project to work on and which one to abandon? How do you choose which journal do you submit your papers to? How much time do you invest in teaching as opposed to research? And the problem is that every school has its own different sort of local culture and its own local incentives. Those local incentives are incredibly powerful. After you've been at a place for a while, you start to absorb the culture and you start to think the way that the senior faculty at that school think. And you start to ask them for advice, and the advice that they give you, oftentimes you actually listen to it. And so, for instance, if you're at a school where they say, oh, you have to have 7 papers for tenure, but we don't care where they're published, that's a very different local incentive than a place that says the number doesn't matter, just the quality. So one of the things I'm going to try to suggest to you is that these local incentives, you should ignore them. And I'll come back to a good reason why in just a little bit, okay? So I was not renewed at mid-clock renewal, whatever. It's very frustrating, it's depressing. And so, just as I'm sure you're all PhD students, I'm sure at some point you've been wallowing in misery and despair of being a PhD student. We all do at some point. And you're thinking about what's plan B, what else can I do? For me, I thought, hey, law school sounds like fun. I know economics, I can do statistics stuff. So I'll just wipe the floor with all those law students. But eventually I sort of came to my senses. And just as I was starting to come to my senses and abandoning my hope of being yet another lawyer in the world, was a visiting position. So thank God, right? So here I am, just having been given a terminal year at my original institution, and a visiting gig pops up. It pops up from a friend who's a conference buddy. So one of the things that I miss about what's going on in the pandemic is, there's no opportunity for me or for you to develop conference buddies, people that sort of in passing, that when the time comes that you need a favor or they need a favor, you can sort of lean on each other. But this was a case where I was able to take advantage of that. And the visiting position was a fantastic job for me, mostly because the colleagues were super welcoming, the resources were great, and I immediately found myself surrounded by people who were working on really interesting things. So one of the things that I learned at this juncture is that research ideas don't happen in a vacuum, right? And you can squirrel yourself away in your, the bedroom of your student apartment, or it'll be an assistant professor apartment, so you'll have a rug. So, that's what you can hope for. They happen better when you're around other people. So for me, that's at the bar. And so my conference friend and I would spend time at the bar and talk about research, or maybe it's at the office, or maybe it's at a group lunch. But for this story, it's the bar. So I'll tell you this is how this really happened. So I was at the bar with my friend, and we were talking about research, and so he says, so tell me, what are you working on? And so I start describing my research and what I'm working on, and go on. I give the 5-minute pitch of my new paper idea, and he looks at me dead in the eye, takes a sip of his beer, and says, Alex, why would you ever work on that when you're capable of writing good papers instead? So, is that a compliment? Is that an insult? I don't know. Either way, it really might be the first time I actually listened when a mentor was trying to help me, trying to give me advice and steer me a little bit. And so that was actually a major turning point for me, because it was like somebody giving me permission to not work on stuff just because it's easy, or just because I have some, vague interest or knowledge of that I should instead take my very limited amount of time to work on things that are bigger and broader, that the profession in general will find interesting. And, believe it or not, that had not occurred to me, that that's how I should be going about choosing my research projects. And so that conversation proceeded, and we ended up writing a paper together, a paper that now is one of my most cited research papers, actually. And we ended up writing several good papers together, and life was good, and things were productive, and I was sort of getting back on track from having been forced into the job market at a time that I wasn't prepared to be forced into the job market. But remember, it was a visiting position, right? And so those things are inherently limited in amount of time. And while I got along great with my colleagues, and it was a very productive time, nonetheless, it was time to find a new place. And it was a time when it was, my CV was still developing, and it was kind of hard to find a new position. And it wasn't until very, very late in the recruiting season that an opportunity arose that I could find a new tenure track position. And so it was a very stressful time. And so I just want you all to know that, you may have a stressful, worrisome time coming up. There's a lot of uncertainty, but the job that I ended up taking, I didn't get that offer until mid-March. So that's super late in the process. These things can happen at any time. So don't give up hope, and recognize that there are already way too many lawyers. So don't even think about going down that path. So I'm at the new job, and I'm trying to figure out what to do. So things didn't go so well at the first job, because I got pulled in every direction. I was, trying to do quantity. I was trying to do quality. I was trying to do teaching. I wasn't doing enough service. What am I doing? And so, I was trying to decide what to do. And I had two pet projects on my mind. One was a solo empirical paper. And by the way, I'll just tell you that working on solo papers is horrible. So once you get your job market paper published, co-authored, because it's just so much more efficient. And I also had a theory paper. This is back when I fancied myself as maybe going to be a theorist, until I realized that I'm not actually good at theory. But I had that, that third year paper that you all probably have somewhere that's in your file drawer. You're thinking, hey, worst case scenario, I'll just pull out that third year paper and work on that. So that, that paper was about to rise from the ashes like a phoenix. And so, I really just wanted to get some points on the board so that I would have a reasonable hope of not getting fired again, not renewed at mid-clock renewal, whatever. And so I was trying to figure out how to allocate my time. Should I revamp the theory paper? I had a sort of a cracked open door at an obscure journal that had given me sort of a really weak revise and resubmit a long time ago. I could try to flesh that out. Or I could try to take the empirical paper, go down to a field journal just to get some points on the board. And then a little voice in my head said, why would you ever work on that when you're capable of writing good papers instead? And so when in times of doubt or trouble, ask yourself, what would your mentor do? That's what WWMMD, what would my mentor do? My mentor would tell me, as long as there's a reasonable chance of getting this published someplace good, you should try that. That's what should come first. Don't just try to get points on the board for point's sake. So I had one more shot at a top journal with that solo empirical paper. That's what I tried to do. I figured the outcome would most likely be a quick rejection, and then I could just drop down to the field journals and get the points on the board, and maybe not look myself in the mirror after that, but that's fine. So I went to the top journal. The editor sent it to a titan in the field, the very person whose work my paper was criticizing. And so that's obviously just sudden death, but the referee actually liked the idea behind the paper, but my execution was terrible because I had spent my grad school career thinking I was going to be a theorist, so I had just willfully shirked all of my econometrics courses, and so I had to teach myself all the stuff so that I could write a decent paper. Finally, I did, wrote the paper, and paper got published, and yay me, things are finally going well. So what did I learn on this journey? One is that mentors bring you to their level, right? And that's, they can bring you up or they can bring you down. So pick a mentor who's going to pull you up to their level, not someone who's going to bring you down. Along those lines, having a set of values and long-term goals that you believe in is critical, because those values and goals provide clarity when you start getting pulled by local incentives, right? Right now, you don't have any local incentives other than what you have learned in your graduate program. But by the time you start your position at whatever school it is, the local stuff starts to seep in. So ex ante, have a set of values and long-term goals to give you clarity. And then when you get pulled in all directions, oh, you're not teaching well enough, you're not doing enough service, quantity versus quality, ask yourself, what would your mentor do? And then here's what I think is the key takeaway for you all, I hope, is optimize your choices around market values, not local incentives, because there's a 70% chance that you'll be glad that you did. If you're one of those 70% that does not get tenure at your first position, all those local incentives are not going to have mattered at all, only to the extent that they are correlated with market values. Okay, so that's the story of my success. So now I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about my view on sort of where we are as a profession thinking about identification. So the title for this segment is Interesting Topic, Evidence from an Oddly Specific Thing. So if you are not familiar with this comic strip XKCD, this is good stuff. So one guy says, I used to think correlation implied causation. Then I took a statistics class, now I don't. Oh, sounds like the class helped. Well, maybe. And so this tees up all the discussion of selection bias and treatment effects and yada, yada, yada. And the sort of alt text for this comic strip says correlation doesn't imply causation, but it does waggle its eyebrow suggestively and gesture furtively while mouth can look over there, okay? So this is taken from a paper by Bowen, Frizard, and Taillard. The paper is titled, What's Your Identification Strategy? And it's basically talking about how has finance evolved in terms of how much energy we spend on identification in papers. And you can see that back in the 80s and 90s, and even up into 2000, basically nobody was writing papers that were taking identification as a serious part of the research process. And that's changed dramatically. I mean, this graph ends in about 2013, but I mean, you probably know what it's like having looked at what's coming out in the journals these days. Pretty much everything in corporate finance and consumer finance these days, if it's published in a top journal, you know it has a good, clearly articulated identification strategy. Asset pricing is coming around. All you asset pricers, you're going to be suffering our pain too soon enough, right? But the world is changing in terms of how we do our social science. But that comes at a cost, okay? So any good empirical paper's biggest strength is almost necessarily also its biggest weakness. No paper can be all things to all people, right? All causal inference is local. And there's this inherent and unavoidable trade-off between the internal and the external validity of an empirical test. So what my advice to you is, if you have, because there's this trade-off, you can't have both. And so, think of it as research judo, where you use any weakness as a strength. And so if you have great internal validity, carefully explain sort of what we learn and where we can extrapolate to from that very cleanly identified thing. And if you have less than rock solid internal validity, instead of letting that be a death knell for the paper, Carefully explain why the external validity that you can achieve makes the project worthwhile anyway. There's a chance that a referee may not buy it, but that is the trade-off that we all face. We either write papers that are sort of that have vanishingly small external validity but clean internal validity, or the opposite. And we have to figure out where to strike a balance. So my sort of general advice for identification zealots such as myself, use the simplest econometrics that are correct. There's no sense in getting fancier than you need to. If you have an instrument or an experiment or a shock or discontinuity, you know, it has some strengths and it also has some weaknesses. So just be honest about how valid your instrument is. What can we actually learn? Articulate your identifying assumption clearly. Your identification doesn't have to be perfect, but it'll help if you can clearly explain what we can learn and what we can't from your exercise. And what I found is that finance is now pretty good about discussing internal validity, but we haven't really sort of come full circle to embrace frank discussions of the external validity of our tests. And so that's one place where I'd like to see us all improve as a group. And one last piece of advice, in a seminar, no matter what, even if you started late, even if it's an IT problem, even whatever, never, ever go over your allotted time. Nobody cares about table 17. So that is, that's all I've got.